Good evening. Let's put a little light on the subject. Welcome to my humble abode, and to this, which is, and I quote, and I should have actually prepared this quicker, but I can improvise, as the great Sir Sean Mason has often drilled into me. Improvisation is the name of the game, particularly when you're improvising. That's it, that's a great whoa, there we go. Mr. PJ probably there. Rendition of a little song that you might have heard of. Anyway, let's crack on. It was the 18th of May, earlier today. So it's less than an hour ago. Anniversary. Right, I'm going to attempt to read you New Dawn Fades. I hope this is not the other way around. New Dawn Fades, a graphic novel about Joy Division in Manchester, written by me, with a foreword by Mick Middles. So, without further ado, New Dawn Fades, a graphic novel. Foreword by Mick Middles. You don't notice greatness when it sits before you, spilling ketchup onto a meat pie. That were my lesson for the day. Before me sat a conciliatory singer, slapping his palm onto a glass bottle with clearly more force than was strictly necessary. Around him sat the remaining three members of Joy Division. Barney Sumner, alert if not resolutely committal. Steve Morris, a kindly hippie fop. And Peter Hook, deep into a tender sulk, while stretched out along the pub's bench seat, leather-capped, and gazing to the ceiling. Manager Rob Gretton was berating me for asking the Nazi question, despite prior to the interview telling me to ask the Nazi question. Go on, you love it, this lot. To my delight and astonishment, this comic scenario made its way into the second half of Brian Gorman's illuminating play, New Dawn Fades. I thought this remarkable, partly because it's nice to get a mention, but mainly because I had not previously written about Rob's deliberate pushing of that incendiary question. Nevertheless, it happened, and Brian was spot on. I have no complaints about this unlikely retelling. He had brilliantly sensed that tiny scenario in the Gaythorne pub in Manchester's Little Island on October 21st, 1978. I, Mick Middles, was interviewing the band for Sounds magazine. It wasn't one of the great rock interviews, I must be honest, but it did give Joy Division their first double page in the national music press. Given that, back then, this was a big deal, a very big deal. One sensed the band, other than in Curtis, could have displayed a small measure of enthusiasm for the interview. At least something beyond the cursory, "Who is this cunt, Rob?" As I wandered gamely into the rehearsal within Tony T.J. Davidson's evocative set of practice rooms on Little Peter Street. Well, it all seemed mightily evocative in later years, as presented in the band's Love Will Tear Us Apart video. And indeed, the perceptive lenses of Kevin Cummins and Anton Corbijn, also fitting. But the reality was a set of decayed and freezing post-industrial rooms painted brown that actually chilled the heart, rather than warmed it. But that is how it was with Joy Division. Things fell into place, seemingly without their input or perception. When they were as cold as fuck to me during said interview, I had no way of knowing they would famously become one of the worst set of interviewees in the history of rock, let alone post-punk. They didn't plan that strategy, which bled through into New Order. The Enemies, Chris Bourne and myself once spent a week with the latter band in New York and Washington, and ended up looking at each other in a state of suspended disbelief. We agreed on two major issues: that New Order were our favourite English band, and that New Order had absolutely nothing to say. Now, that didn't prevent both of us gaining front-page double-issue interviews published on the same day. I don't think any other band achieved such a thing in the history of the British music press. Well, it had been the same with Joy Division. They were clueless in the art of self-promotion, and that very cluelessness managed to gain them immense acreage. I guess once in a generation such happy accidents tend to happen. That simple luck bomb actually warmed their image and the mind-boggling genius of their music. Despite themselves, they floated in a mediumistic brilliance that lay beyond even their own wildest dreams. This innocence also seeps into Brian Gorman's superb writing. His play, and indeed this accompanying graphic novel, finds itself closer to the heart of this most curious of bands than any of the multitude of Joy Division tomes, including my own, that have preceded it. Of course, none of this could have seemed remotely possible back then. The hour which preceded the interview saw the band chug gamely through a full set, with just Rob Gretton and myself in dutiful attendance. I didn't notice greatness at that practice session either, although there had been a noticeable power surge since the bear with me, sorry about this, Mick. I really need some editing software. It'll be in the DVD specials. A noticeable power surge since their stuttering embryonic days as Warsaw. Maybe they were actually emerging confidently from the sludge that defined the second rush of punk. Within weeks of this meeting, Martin Hannett would so famously build light and space into this dark, granite-like sound. Following the TJM rehearsal, we all wandered up to the said pub, the band with heavy hearts it seemed, for I sensed that they regarded such activity as a painful necessity. Even this would later appear significant. Little Island was an evocative, ghostly area with the darkest imaginable past. Joy Division literally walking through a damaged Mancunia. What's more, the area would emerge, if it already had not done so, as a hotspot of cultural resonance. These are for you to write, Mick. 20 yards from the pub, a yachting showroom would be transformed into the Hacienda in 1982. In the immediate shadows behind the pub, the home arts complex and peripheral gastric emporiums would one day spring into existence. In 1985, almost next door to the then defunct T.J. Davidson's, would spring Colin Sinclair's The Boardwalk, a small venue boasting many of the greatest bands of the following 2 decades: Sonic Youth, Radiohead, Oasis, Happy Mondays, In Spiral Carpets, brackets together, close brackets, among them. Tony Wilson's ill-fated Factory 2 offices, and indeed his infamous loft apartment, would be situated directly opposite the boardwalk. Well, perhaps Manchester has always been the kind of town where history and contemporary cultural activity lurk in every darkened shadow. Good writing, Mick. One thing remains certain. Through the dingy and disagreeable, the fantastic habitually looms. One day prior to the interview, Joy Division had made their second appearance at the Factory Club in Hume, playing with Cabaret Voltaire and the Tiller Boys. Although the Cabs were from Sheffield, they always seemed a snug fit within Manchester's industrial fabric, and they would soon emerge, albeit briefly, on the emergent Factory records. Post-punk was forming before our eyes. At this gig, the late John the Postman grabbed my arm and screamed, "You gotta interview Joy Division!" His perceptive awareness seemingly more alert than mine. When New Dawn fades, I tell you what, when you ask Mick Middles to write you a foreword, you don't half get your money's worth. When New Dawn Fades hit its initial run on July 15th, 2013, which would have been Curtis's birthday, modestly housed upstairs at the legendary Lasso Gary pub, I somehow missed the significance of the occasion. Although Rowetta and John Robb were both forthcoming with suitably lavish praise. I think at that point I felt exhausted with the story, having written 2 books on the subject, The Factory Story, Virgin, and Torn Apart, Omnibus Press, co-written with Lindsay Reid. Having feverishly devoured a multitude of worthy Factory tomes, 2 films and 3 documentaries, I think I felt a bit Joy Divisioned out, as many did. Brian and the remarkable cast's achievement didn't become apparent to me until the play opened at Chester's Gateway Theatre in 2015. Stunned by the invention and freshness that had been brought to the familiar tale, we saw it again at Bury Met, the actual scene of the famous Joy Division riot, and twice at Manchester's Dance House. As plays are obviously more fluid than films and books, we enjoyed the nuances and idiosyncrasies that flavoured every performance. At the second Dance House date, a complete technical breakdown saw Lee Joseph's Tony Wilson brilliantly ad-libbing in Wilson-esque style through the unexpected gap. It was a moment little short of thrilling. Do you know, I wasn't actually there on that day. Ian Curtis, back in the day, I did know him, although not that well, and let's face it, the relationship between accessible journalist and intelligent and burgeoning rock star can never be regarded as pure. He was obviously intelligent, affable, and always the one, and perhaps only, member of Joy Division who would be quick to furnish you with a beer if you tripped unexpectedly backstage. During the writing of Torn Apart, I did get to know the late Anik Honori quite well, although this was largely due to her long-standing friendship with co-writer Lindsay Reid. Anique was a lovely soul and the complete fan of music and Madonna. I met her several times during the writing period, both in Brussels and in Macclesfield. Anique wanted us to have use of the letters between her and Ian Curtis. She was clear that she didn't want to give them to the makers of the Ian Curtis biopic Control. Against our better judgment, we persuaded her otherwise. We certainly didn't mean any respect to Deborah Curtis at all, although we were linking into an extremely tangled web. The journalist John Savage, close to Debbie, later told me that feelings were running high as Torn Apart was being written. Nobody conveyed that to us at the time, however. It was news to me. Back in May 2012, we had travelled to Belgium and then Eindhoven in Holland, where, in support of John Cooper Clarke, I would interview Lindsay Reid on the subject of Joy Division. It was an emotive affair, not least because the venue was F&R, the same arts complex, albeit housed in a different building, where Joy Division performed in 1980. What was fascinating here was to witness the utter devotion and adoration that the attentive Dutch held for Joy Division. Devotion? To those four distant lads in that Gaythorne pub? Of course, this broke all the rules. It shouldn't have happened. Not in that way, but it did. It did. What would have happened next had tragedy not so famously struck? Nobody knows, of course. Could Ian Curtis have moved so effortlessly, Bono-like, into Stadium America? Closer to the point, had tragedy not struck and Joy Division's USA tour of 1980 taken place, the band would have found themselves supported in Minneapolis, for instance, by local lads Husker Du in their ferocious, savage young Du emergent stage. Used emergent 3 times in this foreword. Sorry. In their emergent stage. Could Joy Division, who could be beyond brilliance and could be beneath awful, have coped with this? Again, nobody knows. Perhaps, and only perhaps, Ian Curtis had already found his true and intimate arena. Well, that is where the story ends. Although in ending, of course, it really started something. Mick Middles. And this is me. Underneath the foreword, Mick Middles is the author of over 20 books. This is me again reading. Mick Middles is the author of over 20 books, most of which have concentrated on Manchester's music artists from punk to the present. He was the Manchester correspondent for Sounds magazine, and his work has appeared in publications as diverse as The Guardian, Daily Telegraph, The Express, Manchester Evening News, The Face, Kerrang, Classic Rock, Record Collector, Rock and Reel, and The Quietus. We're at my videotape here, Mick. That was the foreword by Sir Michael Middles of Northern England. I think I'll take a break and I'll be back with You Don't Face the graphic novel. I'm going to look into the camera as I do this, or as I just do this.